The trade war has just reached a new level, and those who will feel the direct impact are you. The European Union's new retaliation aims exactly where it hurts the most: the American automobile industry. Car prices will skyrocket, jobs are at risk, and the economy could collapse. But how did this happen? Who really wins? And most importantly, is there a way out? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes I will reveal behind the scenes of this counterattack, like this affects your pocket, and which the next steps that could change everything. Imagine waking up and discovering that car prices in the United States have just skyrocketed. Factories are under threat, and thousands of jobs are at risk. It sounds like an economic thriller film, but it's the reality we're living in now. Europe pulled the trigger and triggered a retaliation that could completely change the game of the American auto industry. Donald Trump is making headlines again, and this time the impact is global. A new trade war is unfolding before our eyes, and if you think it doesn't affect you, think again. This dispute between the USA and Europe can affect your pocket, your work, and even the future of the economy. What's behind this European counterattack? Who are the real winners and losers in this silent but devastating war? And above all, what will be Trump's next step in the face of this crisis that is just beginning? In the next few minutes, we will reveal the behind the scenes of this clash and what could happen next. Get ready, because what we're going to show you could change your view of the future of the global economy. If you love cars and don't want to see prices skyrocket because of these tariffs, sign up now to stay up to date with everything that is happening in the American economy. The decision was quick and without warning. In a move that took the world by surprise, Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on European car imports, throwing gasoline on the fire of a trade war that was already about to explode. For his administration, this measure was necessary to protect American industry. But what actually happened was the opposite. Automakers are now facing sky-high costs. Dealerships are anticipating massive increases in vehicle prices, and worse, workers in these factories may be the first to feel the direct impact of cuts and layoffs. But Europe did not sit idly by. The response was brutal and surgical. Within hours, the European Union counterattacked with its own list of retaliatory tariffs, targeting where it hurts most: the agricultural market, the technology sector, and mainly the export of American vehicles to the European continent. The impact of this retaliation is already beginning to be felt. Recent data shows that this new wave of tariffs could reach up to 56 billion euros in American exports, stifling companies that depend on international trade and directly threatening what remains of economic stability in the United States. The situation is critical, and the question that remains is, how far can this trade war go? Major automakers are already warning that manufacturing cars in the United States will become more expensive than ever, passing on the losses directly to consumers. But this is not the only consequence. Tensions rose to alarming levels. If Trump's intention was to put pressure on Europe, the effect was exactly the opposite. The European Union's response came like a missile, reaching strategic sectors of the United States with surgical precision. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, made it clear that Europe will not accept being hostage to unfair tariffs. In a blunt statement, she stated that the bloc is fully prepared to defend its economic interests with all necessary force. And this defense has already begun. Retaliation came with heavy tariffs on products essential to the American economy. Agricultural exports were the first to feel the impact, with high taxes on soy, beef, and poultry. These measures were meticulously calculated to target key states that form Trump's base of political support. Farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, already struggling with previous trade disputes, now find themselves in an even weaker position. The price of American soybeans, for example, has fallen drastically on the international market as producers desperately seek new trade routes to avoid financial collapse. But the European counterattack did not stop there. The EU has imposed tariffs on consumer goods, technology, and even materials essential to the American automobile industry. Electronic components, semiconductors, and precision parts manufactured in Germany and France, essential for automakers such as Ford and Tesla, now arrive in the US at very high costs. This means that the production of these vehicles will become more expensive, slower, and ultimately unaffordable for millions of American consumers. To make matters worse, the EU. It's not just reacting, it's preparing for a protracted trade war. Restrictive measures that had been suspended during the Biden administration are now back. From April 1st, an even larger wave of sanctions will be implemented, directly targeting American exports worth $19.6 billion. And this could still be just the beginning. While Trump insists that his strategy is aimed at strengthening the domestic economy, experts warn that this battle could become a long-term nightmare for American companies themselves. And the impact is not just limited to trade between the US and Europe. Other global giants are keeping an eye on the situation and preparing to act. China, for example, has already started negotiations to position itself as a new preferred trading partner for Europe, offering alternatives to replace taxed American products. If that happens, it could deal a fatal blow to the United States, shifting its influence in global trade and creating new alliances that could change the dynamics of the world economy forever. What was just a tariff dispute has now turned into an economic battle of unprecedented proportions, with a domino effect that could affect several industries, jobs, and above all, the financial stability of Americans. And with the next rounds of sanctions and tariffs quickly approaching, the true impact of this trade war is still far from being fully understood. What's to come could be even more devastating. This is not the first time that a commercial confrontation like this has happened. And if history has taught us anything, it is that the consequences can be much more devastating than imagined. Just remember Donald Trump's first term when he imposed heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, claiming that the US was being harmed by unfair trade deals. The result? An immediate reaction from the European Union, which targeted iconic American products such as Harley-Davidson, bourbon whiskey, and Levi's jeans, causing a direct impact on the American economy. At the time, many companies were forced to raise prices or even move part of their operations outside the United States. Exactly the opposite of what Trump had promised. And now, history is repeating itself, but this time on a much larger scale. If before the dispute was concentrated in specific sectors, now we are talking about an all-out trade war, where the auto industry, technology, and American agriculture are on the front lines of the crossfire. The problem is that in any trade war, there are no winners. In 2018, when Trump got into a tariff dispute with China, the American economy suffered profound impacts, with exports falling, supply chains being disrupted, and billions of dollars in subsidies being needed to keep farmers and businesses afloat. The difference now is that the risks are even greater. Europe is not only one of the United States' main trading partners, but also a strategic ally on issues that go far beyond trade. And if this dispute worsens, it could shake not just the economy, but also political stability between two of the most powerful blocs on the planet. Experts warn that if tensions continue to escalate, the impacts could go beyond the limits of the automobile sector and even reach the pharmaceutical, energy, and financial industries, creating an unprecedented domino effect. Looking back, it's impossible to ignore the signs. In 1930, during the Great Depression, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Act, which imposed heavy tariffs on foreign products, trying to protect domestic industry. But instead of boosting the economy, the measure ended up triggering a global reaction. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, world trade plummeted, and what was already an economic crisis turned into an unprecedented collapse. Now, nearly a century later, we face an alarmingly similar situation. Tariffs being used as weapons, allies turning into adversaries, and the real risk of a global slowdown driven by an unchecked trade war. Historical parallels are undeniable, and if there is anything we can learn from the past, it is that these clashes always have a high cost. What began as an attempt to balance the trade balance can quickly turn into a major crisis, affecting not only large business people and investors, but also the common citizen, who may soon feel the weight of this trade war in their pockets. But what remains unclear is whether the United States has learned from past mistakes, or whether it is about to repeat the same steps that led to some of the biggest economic crises in history. And the answer to that question could define the future of millions of people. What do you think? Do Trump's measures really protect the US, or are they a shot in the foot that will hit Americans' pockets first? Comment below and tell me your opinion. The brutal reality of this trade war is beginning to knock on the doors of ordinary citizens. If before tariff disputes seemed like a distant problem, Restricted to major negotiations between governments and billion-dollar corporations, now the impact is direct, real, and impossible to ignore. For starters, the price of cars in the United States is about to skyrocket. With the new tariffs making imports of European parts absurdly expensive, automakers such as Ford, General Motors, and Tesla are already warning of significant increases in production costs. This means that, in a few months, consumers will feel the effects of this economic battle in their pockets, whether buying a new car or just trying to keep theirs running with replacement parts that now cost much more. And it's not just the automotive sector that's being hit. Rising transportation and production costs are spreading throughout the supply chain, driving up prices for essential goods like electronics, food, and even fuel. In supermarkets, basic products that depend on efficient logistics and imported raw materials are already beginning to undergo readjustments. The impact will be even more severe in states that rely heavily on agriculture and exports to Europe. Farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota are among the hardest hit, as EU retaliation directly targets soybeans, beef, and corn produced in those states. Many of these farmers were already struggling to keep their businesses profitable following trade disputes with China, and now they face a new nightmare. But the situation gets even worse when we look at workers in the automobile industry. Thousands of jobs are at risk, especially at factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, where automakers rely heavily on components imported from Europe to keep their production lines running. With costs rising and demand falling due to high prices, layoffs become a real possibility. The Automotive Workers Union itself has already issued a warning that, if this tariff war drags on, hundreds of thousands of jobs could be cut in the coming months. And while Americans deal with the brunt of these measures, Europeans are not left unscathed either. Cars made in the United States now arrive in Europe with 25% tariffs, making brands like Jeep, Ford, and Tesla significantly more expensive for European consumers. Dealers in Germany, France, and Italy are already beginning to predict a drastic drop in sales of American vehicles, which could lead companies like Ford to drastically reduce their exports to the continent. Furthermore, Europe depends on imports of liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the United States to fuel much of its energy demand, and now that trade is also at risk. With tensions escalating, the EU has already begun negotiations with new suppliers, such as Qatar and Australia, to reduce its dependence on American gas. If this shift comes to fruition, the US could lose billions in revenue, and the impacts could be devastating for energy-producing states like Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, where much of the economy depends on gas exports. The scenario that emerges is one of a relentless domino effect. The cost of living rises, companies struggle to remain competitive, and the jobs that Trump promised to protect begin to disappear. But the real question now is, how long will the United States be able to sustain this war without the population feeling even more of the weight of the consequences? And more importantly, who will really win in this seemingly never-ending dispute? As the United States and Europe wage this unprecedented economic battle, other global powers are moving behind the scenes, ready to take advantage of the chaos. China, for example, has been closely watching every step of this trade war and has already begun to act to occupy the space left by American products in Europe. Chinese companies in technology, automobiles, and even the agricultural sector are approaching the European market with new commercial partnerships, ensuring that if the US loses ground, Beijing will be there to fill the void. And it doesn't stop in China. Japan and South Korea also see this dispute as an opportunity to strengthen their exports to the West. Automakers like Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Kia now have a strategic advantage over American companies because their vehicles are not subject to the same heavy tariffs imposed by the European Union. If previously brands like Ford and Jeep still had a relevant share in the European market, now consumers can simply opt for cheaper and more accessible Japanese and South Korean alternatives. The result? Not only does the US lose sales, but it also sees its influence over the global automotive sector rapidly diminish. But the impact is not just limited to cars. The technology industry is about to undergo a major change. The United States has always dominated this sector, especially in the manufacture of semiconductors and chips, essential for modern electronics and automobiles. However, with trade tensions growing, Europe is already starting to look for new suppliers to reduce its dependence on American companies such as Intel, Qualcomm, and Nvidia. This opens up space for closer ties with Chinese and Taiwanese manufacturers who can take a leading role in this market. And if this seems worrying, the situation in the energy sector is even more alarming. Europe depends on the US to meet its need for liquefied natural gas, LNG, but is now looking for alternative suppliers. Countries like Qatar and Australia have already begun negotiating new contracts to reduce dependence on American energy. If these deals go through, it could mean billions of dollars lost for the US energy sector, directly affecting states like Texas, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania that rely on gas exports to keep their economies stable. This clash between the US and Europe is not just a tariff war. It is a complete reconfiguration of global trade. While Washington insists on its protectionist strategy, other nations are reorganizing to build new alliances and strengthen their position in the international market. The biggest risk for the United States is not just losing money, but losing geopolitical influence. If Europe turns to China as a more reliable and predictable trading partner, it could completely change the balance of economic power in the world. Ultimately, the big question that remains in the air is, to what extent can the United States continue to sustain this trade war before the political and economic cost becomes unbearable? And will other countries seize this opportunity to rewrite the rules of global trade as the US increasingly isolates itself? The next moves in this dispute could define the future of the world economy, and time is running out. Experts have already started to outline scenarios for the coming months, and the forecasts are not at all encouraging. If the United States and the European Union do not find a solution to this trade war, the impact could be devastating not only for the industries directly affected, but for the entire global economy. The warning comes from renowned economists and financial analysts who are closely following the developments in this dispute. According to a report from the American Chamber of Commerce, escalating tariffs could cost the U.S. economy billions of dollars in annual losses, leading to a domino effect that will affect entire industries, from manufacturing to retail. And if trade between the two blocs continues to deteriorate, recession will not just be a risk, but a certainty. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has already signaled that a prolongation of this conflict could reduce U.S. GDP growth by up to 1.2% over the next 2 years, with an even greater impact on job creation. American automakers, already struggling to compete globally, could see their sales plummet, forcing mass layoffs and factory closures. The same applies to the agricultural sector, which would lose strategic markets to competitors such as Brazil and Argentina, which are already moving to occupy the space left by American products in Europe. But not all is lost. Some experts point out that there are still ways to reverse this crisis before the damage becomes irreversible. Diplomacy may yet be the key to avoiding a total collapse. European leaders have already expressed their willingness to negotiate, but have made it clear that they will not accept a unilateral agreement imposed by Washington. European Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič recently stated that the EU is open to dialogue, but only if there is a real commitment from the US to strike a fair balance. One of the possible solutions would be a trade compensation agreement, in which the United States would agree to reduce or eliminate some tariffs in exchange for new concessions from the European Union, such as the relaxation of some regulations on American products. This would help restore trust between trading partners, and prevent other powers such as China and Russia from taking advantage of the situation to further weaken transatlantic ties. Another alternative would be a strategic subsidy model, in which the U.S. government would help its hardest-hit industries offset the costs of the tariffs. However, this solution has a big problem. It would cost public coffers billions and could generate even more tension among allies, who would see this as an attempt to artificially manipulate the market. The riskiest option, and also the one most feared by financial markets, would be the maintenance and expansion of the trade war, with new rounds of even more aggressive tariffs, affecting sectors that until now were relatively protected. If this happens, the effect could be a real economic disaster. Companies that depend on global supply chains could collapse, consumers will see prices soar, and even investors will begin to withdraw their capital from the US, seeking more stable and predictable markets. Given this scenario, the question that remains is, will the American government have the courage to back down and negotiate before it is too late? Or will Trump double down, believing he can win this trade war without considering the devastating impact it could have on millions of Americans. Time for a solution is running out, and if nothing is done quickly, the consequences could be much worse than anyone imagines. Time is running out, and each new sanction imposed, each retaliation announced, brings us closer to a scenario where no one wins. Skyrocketing car prices, job losses, the collapse of entire industries, all of this is no longer a distant possibility. It is an imminent reality. If this trade war continues unchecked, the U.S. could face an unprecedented crisis as other powers take up the slack. The future of global trade is at stake, and the impact could be irreversible. And now, what will be the next step in this trade war? Do you think Trump's measures will strengthen the United States or just further harm American workers and consumers? If you are worried about the impact of these retaliations, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any updates on this economic crisis. If you've made it this far, comment below. The future is at risk, so I know you followed through to the end. And of course, leave a like so that more people can stay informed about what's really happening. Now the next video is on your screen. Click and continue following the developments in this dispute that could change everything.